As I've become much more frustrated with my job situation, I found this article, came out a few months back from The Atlantic by Adele Wallman, and it's called How Part Time Jobs Became a Trap. The subheader is For millions of American low wage workers today, the problem is not overwork, it's underwork. Several years ago, to research the novel I was writing, I spent 6 months working in the warehouse of a big box store. As a supporter of the Fight for 15, I expected my coworkers to be frustrated that starting pay at the store was just $12.25 an hour. In fact, I found them to be less concerned about the wage than about the irregular hours. The store, like much of the American retail sector, used just-in-time scheduling to track customer flow on an hourly basis and anticipate staffing needs at any given moment. My coworkers and I had no way to know how many hours of work we'd get and thus how much money we'd earn from week to week. We'd be scheduled for 4 hours one week and 30 the next. For my coworkers, these fluctuating paychecks made it nearly impossible to get an auto loan or to be approved for a lease on an apartment, let alone to save money. Many didn't have cars. They walked to work in the middle of the night. Our shift started at 4 a.m. in the snow and the rain. Even more maddening, in many states, social safety net programs such as Medicaid and food stamps require beneficiaries to document their work hours, meaning that if workers are, through no fault of their own, scheduled for too few hours in a given period, they could lose the very benefits that their lack of hours makes them need even more. Human resource departments usually tell workers that the way to get more hours is to increase their availability. That is, if you want more hours at one job, you're advised to promise to be available whenever you may be wanted. This makes it very hard to hold down a second job. One of the great achievements of 20th century American labor law was to set limits on how many hours of work an employer could demand from its employees. In recent years, however, working class Americans have become susceptible to a different sort of exploitation. Instead of assigning employees too many hours, large corporations routinely give them too few, hiring multiple part-time staff in place of one full-time worker. These precarious contingent workers aren't entitled to benefits and are subject to inconsistent schedules in which the number of hours they work fluctuates dramatically from week to week. The result is an inversion of the situation that reformers confronted a century ago. For millions of American low-wage workers today, the problem is not overwork, it's underwork. Work as Americans understand it began in 1940 with a piece of New Deal legislation. Before then, Americans commonly worked 60 or 80 hours a week for little more than subsistence level pay. Even the most mythologized jobs in industry and manufacturing, the good jobs that Americans regret losing to globalization, consisted of dangerous poverty level work. Then came the Fair Labor Standards Act. The FLSA established the federal minimum wage and limited child labor, and it stipulated that employers pay most non-managerial workers overtime or time and a half for all hours worked beyond 40 in a week. Combined with the rise of unionization, the FLSA changed work in fundamental ways. Americans began to believe something novel in human history, that if a person was willing to work, he or she should be able to make a decent living. Maybe not a lavish one, but more than the kind of bare sustenance that always been the lot of most human beings. When popular songs and movies use 9 to 5 as a shorthand for work, they are referring not to some natural phenomenon, but to a way of life formalized by the FLSA. Over the past 20 years, however, employers have figured out a clever way to circumvent the FLSA, taking advantage of the fact that the law sets a ceiling on work but not a floor. In 2005, New York Times obtained a revealing memo written by a senior Walmart human resource executive. The memo, drafted with advice from McKinsey consultants, recommended various ways of cutting costs. One of these suggestions would become particularly consequential: hiring more part-time workers. A year later, the Times revealed that Walmart planned to double the percentage of its workers who are part-time from 20% of its workforce to 40%. Walmart is hardly unique in that regard, as Target, for example, where pay starts at $50 an hour, the median employee makes not $31,200, the annualized full-time equivalent, but $27,090, meaning that at least half of its employees are part-time. Kohl's and TJX, the owner of such stores as TJ Maxx, Marshalls, and Home Goods, also rely on predominantly part-time workforces. The most obvious reason employers favor part-time labor is to avoid paying benefits. Starbucks, for example, talks up its generous benefits, but the median Starbucks worker made just $14,674 last year. For baristas who earn a $15 minimum wage, this amounts to about 19 hours a week, just shy of the 20 hours a week that the company requires to be eligible for those benefits. But an even bigger and less well understood driver of the shift to part time work is the rise of just in time scheduling. With a part time workforce made up of workers not guaranteed a set number of hours, employers can schedule the bare minimum number of work hours they expect to need on a given day. If business turns out to be brisker than expected, as it often does, they have a reserve of part time workers to call on at the last minute. The ability to schedule low and add more worker hours as needed saves employers money by freeing them from the necessity of offering and paying for 40 hours a week, or whatever number of hours it defines as full time, week in and week out, even when business is slow. For the system to operate effectively, workers must be not merely part-time, but also unscheduled, so desperate for more hours that they will reliably come in at the last minute. Employers and many economists argue that this approach is efficient because it allows businesses to use only the number of worker hours they actually need. That is true in the same sense that child labor and 80-hour work weeks were efficient during the original Gilded Age. The fact that what is most efficient for an employer might prevent workers from living stable, prosperous, healthy lives is why labor laws exist. Employers and industry lobbyists also claim that they are merely responding to employee preference. The National Retail Federation, the country's largest retail trade organization, argues that flexibility and part-time options are essential for many employees, such as students pursuing a degree, working parents, and teenagers. In fact, the available evidence suggests that most part-time workers would prefer to have stable full-time work. A survey of more than 6,000 Walmart employees conducted by the Center for Popular Democracy, a progressive advocacy group, found that 69% of part-time workers would like to be full-time. If Walmart wished to contest this claim, it could conduct its own survey, but the nation's largest employers have not only chosen not to disclose precisely what percentage of their workforce are part-time, they also haven't released any data to support their claim that many workers prefer these sorts of schedules. Meanwhile, issues concerning hours are often among the first demands made by employees who form unions today. The platform of Target Workers Unite, for example, lists as its first demand not increased hourly pay or better benefits, but more hours. The second demand is stable schedules. The platform goes on to say, Target workers can't live decent lives when we have no fixed schedules or no guaranteed hours, while we are encouraged to have open availability and be on call for any open last-minute shifts. The FLSA worked as well as it did because it dealt with the two components of income, wages and hours, whereas efforts to raise minimum wage alone, however well intended, deal with only half of the equation. But for all of its virtues, the FLSA never contemplated the problem of underwork. Congress has the power to correct that oversight. It could require large employers to set schedules in advance, as some municipalities have done in recent years. It could remove some of the incentives for employing people part-time by either rewarding businesses for hiring full-time workers or penalizing them, such as by charging them the equivalent of benefits for hiring part-time workers. Another modification of the law would be to let hourly workers at big firms choose whenever they want to work part or full-time, the same way they choose to sign up for health insurance or change insurers during an annual window. The advantage of this approach is that it doesn't involve the federal government putting its finger on the scale in favor of a particular type of employment. Instead, it allows employees to determine what type of schedule works best for them, something that should appeal to employers who have spent years insisting that they've moved to part-time schedules because that's what their employees want. But none of these or any other reform ideas will gain any traction unless the issue of part-time work becomes a political issue, much the minimum wage has. So far, the dismantling of 9 to 5, of the kind of steady, predictable work it assumed, has gone largely unnoticed, except among low-wage workers themselves, who unfortunately tend to lack access to levers of power. One reason for this is the very success of the FLSA. It so effectively instilled the 40-hour work week as the norm that even many economists habitually assume that workers choose whether they work full-time or part-time. The Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates annual earnings in various sectors by multiplying the average reported hourly wage by 2,080. The number of hours you'd work if you worked 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. As a result, many earning statistics that are widely relied on for policy prescriptions have become more aspirational than reality-based. A second reason is that professional class workers tend to imagine part-time work as a mutually beneficial arrangement agreed on by employee and employer, say for a mother who'd like to spend more time at home with her young children. For professional workers, this is what part-time work generally has been. But the appeal of just-in-time scheduling for employers is not inherently limited to low-wage professions. Even those of us who don't work in a retail or food service environment could find that our jobs nonetheless can be made more flexible, organized around projects or workload rather than customer flow. This has happened already to some white-collar jobs. Consider higher education, where well-paid full-time positions for professors have been replaced with tenuous part-time adjunct gigs. Without a concentrated policy response, more industries could be affected. You might think your boss needs you for 40 hours every week of the year, but are you sure? So that's where the article ends. It's so good because it talks about how people are really missing the point in terms of, so it is significant to raise the wages, right? 725 is too little. But what good is raising the wages if there's no way to cap the lack of hours that a job can give you if it so chooses? By having a system of, okay, 40 is the maximum and they have to pay you more, but less than 10 is the minimum, and then they have to either pay you more or have some other penalty for your lack of usage. We've really created a system where so many employers in different types of industries, right, retail, the fast food places, are just determined to not half use the people they have as employees, which is part of that pyramid scheme of not having to pay you more money and also not having to give you benefits. And thanks to the difficulty associated with trying to get two jobs, right, where they want open availability, they want you to be available to them 7 days a week, even if they're only going to use you twice or three times each week. It makes it even more difficult to just attempt to get 40, even from two jobs. But this is a really good article. It touched on a lot of the stuff that I've been ranting about for the last few months. And, I'm going to just say this. It's really sad that all people want to do is work. And at every turn, they are given such pushback in terms of like the itty bitty number of hours they're given, or this come at the last minute crap, or not being able to get a second job because both of them want them to have open availability. I mean, it's insane, and more people should be discussing this. It shouldn't be controversial that people want to work a full schedule. Like I'm so sick of these goddamn corporations and these stupid politicians.